Hello, my name is Foluke Adebisi. I'm a lecturer in law at the University of Bristol. I've been asked to give you a very short overview of colonization or colonialism. My focus in this very short talk will be on colonization in Africa because that's my area of interest. But it should be noted that the mechanisms and logics that I'll be talking about in this lecture were quite similar to how colonization was operationalized in places such as Asia, Australasia, and the Americas. So colonization in Africa is often sort of dated to the Berlin Conference of 1884. Prior to the Berlin Conference of 1884, it should be noted that most of, well, that you would say the history of Africa between 1600s and this time had been sort of overwhelmed by depopulation because of the trade in enslaved Africans. So there had been quite a lot of instability for about 200 years already. At the end of the slave trade and between the end of the slave trade and then you also have the end of slavery, which I should remember are two different things, there were more incursions into the hinterlands of the African continent by Europeans. So what had happened during the practice of trading enslaved Africans was that most of the interactions with Europeans had been on the coastlines of Africa. But when that ended, there was more incursions and people sort of claiming land as property of their own nations, their own European nations. So Portugal, the Dutch, Spain, England, and obviously France and Germany. Germany was also quite a large power at that, well, involved in colonization at that time. So what happened was that because it was a little bit, it was a bit fuzzy, these sorts of overlapping incursions, they decided, all the people who were involved in this, all the European nations who were involved in these incursions, decided to have this meeting in Berlin. So it happened over a couple of years, but then they had sort of documents that came out in 1884. So it's why it's called the Berlin Conference of 1884. America was also at this conference, but it should be noted that there was no African representative at this conference. So the purpose of the conference was to decide who owns what. So which European power owned which bit of Africa. So they had this conference in Germany, and then they decided, who owned what bit of Africa, and that's when you could say the colonization of Africa was formally decided or settled. So what is colonization, if we think about it in almost legal technical terms? It can be defined as the act of a foreign power exercising authority in every sphere. That is important because that's what we'll look at in the next few slides. So controlling all their resources, deciding their politics, their economics, their public services, finances, very important. How it happened across the continent of Africa, notice a massive, massive continent, very sort of different ways. In some cases, there would be sort of a document would be signed. The European official will go to someone who was in a position of authority within, a sort of like a town, village, city, and then, or kingdom, and go, give them a document to sign. They would sign it, and the import of the document in many cases would be misrepresented. So they would say, well, we want to enter into trade with you, please sign this document. And then later on, they will come back to say that the document actually meant that we now own your land. In certain instances, colonization was operationalized by means of violent conquest. In many cases, that was, you try and avoid that, but in certain cases, it was unavoidable. There was also the use of trading companies, some of the more notorious ones, the Royal African Company and the Imperial East Africa Company. And you would find examples of this also across Asia. I think is the East India Company was also quite notorious. Once the colonization had happened, there are three main methods of administration of colonies. There's assimilation, indirect rule, or occupier colonization. Assimilation was very much what France, the French Empire, how they operationalize their own methods or schemes of colonization, which is essentially to say, now you are French, so everything about your sort of culture, tradition, methods of government that you used to have before, you have to do away with them. Now you are, you have to become French. And you see this very much across West Africa. Algeria is a particularly notorious example. Indirect rule was a system used by the British. So essentially, you don't get involved in the politics as such, or the sort of the everyday workings of the colony. You choose one person who is already in a position of authority, and then you tell them this is how you're going to run the government, and you report to us. So it's indirect rule. In cases where the person who's already in a position of power doesn't want to obey the colonial instruction, they usually get removed and somebody else will be replaced. But the intervention into everyday workings of the colony much more reduced than in the French colonies. And then you have occupier colonization, which is essentially on the African continent. This is what happened in South Africa. So it's a mixture of British and Dutch colonization. So you've got South Africa, Zimbabwe, to a certain extent, used to be called Rhodesia. Occupier colonization is what you would find in Australia and in North America as well, Canada and the United States. So they're slightly different systems of government. One thing to note is that there's quite a number of colonial plantations. It's often quite interesting that we think of colonization and the practice of slavery as really, really different things. But with colonization, the use of plantations in much a similar way to the way in which plantations were used in the Americas. So between 1500 and 1800, there were island plantations in Cape Verde, Sao Tome and Principe, and Zanzibar. These were set up by the Portuguese. There were French and Dutch plantations in South Africa, Reunion, Mauritius, and West Africa, because most of West Africa was colonized by the French. You could also find French and Dutch plantations in quite a lot of Asia as well. So Indonesia, for example, palm oil plantations were found there. The Belgians colonized the Congo, now known as the Democratic Republic of Congo, and I'll come back to this in a few slides, quite infamously rubber plantations in the Congo, but also oil palm plantations. The British had tea plantations in Kenya, also in India. Spanish had cocoa and tobacco plantations in Bioko, also known as Fernando Po. There's a quite interesting, quite nice movie on Netflix called Palm Trees in the Snow, which provides, the cocoa plantations provides quite a, I would say, beautiful background to, the main story. And I've written a review about that, which you can find on that link. So the way in which the colonial plantations worked was that they usually used indentured labor, which was labor that was almost enforced. So people were not, kidnapped and enslaved as such, but they were paid very little in many cases. They were asked to work, in place of sort of something bad not happening to their, to their family or things like that. But the colonial governments gave the plantation owners, who were usually expatriates, so people who had come from the mother country, they gave them low-cost land grants. So they basically gave them the land. Remember, the land was taken from the people who were already on the land and then given to to the expatriates, and then the expatriates would pay the colonial government, so basically the mother country, a very little sum of money for the land. I mean, there's a whole sort of almost legal argument which you could go into on how you take, how do you acquire land from people who own, whose, the land belongs to them as a community, not as an individual. Or you'd say they don't actually say that they own the land and you turn land into something that you own, but not enough space within this lecture for that particular discussion. In many cases, as I've said, the local population was forced to work these plantations, and the people who so the people who run the plantations were usually told what to plant, and the local population had to buy from these massive plantations. So you had to buy food from them. You couldn't buy from smaller sort of farmers. So you couldn't buy from smaller farms. So essentially the smaller farmers had to go and work for the bigger plantations because no one was buying food from them. In many cases, the plantations produced most of the colony's exports. So this is how the colony made money, but the money went straight to the colonial government. And one question you could ask, question for reflection, is how do we, when we say that the practice of, enslavement ended, did it really end if you still had colonial plantations where there was, more or less forced labor, very little money being paid to those who were doing the work? So colonization in practice entailed quite a lot of sort of economic imperatives. So you could say then that the main task of colonization was to open up the continent, in this case, depending on where you are, what context you're thinking about, but in this case, the continent of Africa. Main task was to open up the continent to accumulation of capital. And you couldn't do that without a transport system. Now, this map of the continent of Africa and its railway system, so the lines you see on the map are the railway systems, so the train lines. So this map comes from the early 1900s. I think it's 1902, but I'm not specifically sure. So if you look at all the rail lines go straight up from the coast to the hinterland, and the whole purpose of these rail lines is to go into the hinterland, get all the produce that had been produced, sort of the things that had been produced by the colonial plantations, bring them to the shore, and then ship them to the mother country. And as you can see, the lines rarely intersected. So especially so if you look at West Africa, for example, where you have a sort of spotting of different colonial authorities. So you've got French, in some cases, you've got a French colony, then a British colony, then a French colony and a British colony. The train lines never intersected. And it's quite interesting that these train lines, because you can't, you really cannot uproot you can't dig them up. So these train lines and the way in which they do not intersect still remain that way till today. There's also the system of taxation. So colonized were compelled to buy goods. So once you had plantations would sort of develop plant these goods, take them to the mother country, and then they would be, say for example, cotton from Kenya, taken to Manchester was a place in which a lot of this was sort of cotton was turned into textile, and then they would be brought back to the colony or to any of the colonies, and then the colonial population would be compelled to buy these manufactured goods. So it was actually quite a profitable system in that sense. So the taxation system was basically you pay your taxes and don't go to prison. And I often say that it works in sort of a way that you see in these mafia movies from Hollywood, where they, you go to shopkeepers and you say, well, pay me something or I don't break your legs. But there was quite a lot of agitation against the taxation system because the money they had to pay kept on, going up. So America, the United States of America, actually declared independence because of this taxation system. The French colonial taxation system is something that, the former French colonies are still railing against because it is maintained to a certain extent. The pictures you have on the screen, top left, you have someone who was a chief, and I forget his name now, who was arrested because there was a hot tax war of 1898 in Sierra Leone. At the bottom, you have the women who fought the Aba Women's War of 1929 in Nigeria, and top right you have Funmilayo Ransome Kuti, who was one of the leaders of the Abeokuta Women's Revolt of 1947. So these taxation systems were always resisted. And then you think about the connection between taxation and the public services. On average, only about 3.4% of the colonial tax that was collected in this way was actually spent on education. And distribution of schools often reflected places that were being exploited for agricultural produce. So say, for example, you had a tea plantation somewhere. There would be schools there to ensure that the people who had to work on the tea plantation, the clerks, the sort of the messengers, could speak enough English to work on the tea plantation. But other areas of the colony where you didn't have plantations, you didn't need people to work on, to interact with the expatriate colonizers, there would be no need to have those schools. There's very little spent on health. Again, the same logics applied to health as applied to education. For example, in 1936, Gold Coast, which is now called Ghana, had 995 hospital beds. Ghana is about 3 times, let's say 2.5 times the size of the United Kingdom. In 1936, there were only 995 hospital beds across the entire colony. Most of the money from taxation was spent on resisting the agitation against colonization. So about 27 to 30% of colonial tax was spent on defense, and the rest went back to the mother country. So it also should be noted that even though this is not spoken about, often, colonization only happened or could only extend for that long because a lot was spent on putting down, violently putting down resistance, ensuring compliance. So there are some notable colonial atrocities, and I'm only going to give 3 examples very briefly. Belgian Congo, which I mentioned earlier, was the way in which it was run was really quite violent, and there continue to be agitations, a request for that to be noted even to this day. So Belgian Congo was run by means of what you would consider to be a slave society, complete enslavement and subjugation of the entire country. The population was forced to serve or to work on the plantations, and they had quotas which they had to meet. Anyone who didn't meet their quota of harvested rubber would be punished by death. The force publique was the sort of police force which was meant to enforce that rule, and they were given bullets. So to save their bullets, because the evidence that they had shot someone for not meeting their rubber quota was they would show their, bring their hand or their leg. But to save their bullets so they could use them for other things, they would cut off people's hands and or legs or feet, without actually shooting them. So they, you know, they would leave their victim to die. I mean, as you can see in the pictures, not everyone died. And then there's the picture at the bottom is someone who didn't meet his rubber coater, and his daughter's leg and hand were cut off and presented to him. So during this period, there was a population decline, which was put at between 2 and 13 million. So not only did the population, so the population, not just that it sort of, you know, usually populations go up, population went down. So about 60% of the population died during this period where the Belgians were in charge of what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo. When the Germans were in charge of Namibia, they engaged in what is considered the first genocide of the 20th century of the Herero and Nama people between the late 1890s and up to 1904. So the Nama and the Herero resisted colonization, as is natural, and the Germans sort of put down that resistance quite violently. Men, women, children were shot, starved, and tortured. It's estimated about 100,000 of them, of the Herero and Nama, were killed. You know, presently, the Herero and Nama people are more or less, you know, quite close to extinction. Anyone who survived was sent into concentration camps or sent to fight for Germany in the First World War. 3,000 skulls were sent to Berlin, and, you know, German scientists compared the skulls to, you know, sort of try and find out examples or evidence of racial inferiority. Some of those skulls are still in the American Museum of Natural History. Return has been requested, has not yet been granted. In Kenya, so, you know, I talked about, you know, the appropriation of land. So a lot of land belonging to the people of Kenya, to communities of Kenya, was appropriated for to establish tea plantations. So the choicest bits of land. So there was what is called the Mau Mau Rebellion, where it started out with a, you know, agitation of give us back our land to, you know, get out of our country. It's estimated about 20,000 people were killed when this rebellion was being put down. About 320,000 to 250,000 people were imprisoned, about 1 million in concentration camps. Lots of people were tortured, sexually assaulted. There was a recent case in the High Court in the UK around that particular. So people who had been tortured and assaulted, asking for reparation and redress. So I would end with again a reflection on why colonization in Africa happened, as I have, and colonization as a whole, but using this as an example. As I have gone through, you know, this very short overview, it should be noted, or it would be noted, that a lot of the things I have mentioned had to do with economics. So without economics, without the financial imperatives, colonization is unlikely to have happened. So it's sometimes argued that, you know, people were taught to be, were considered to be inferior, and therefore were colonized or enslaved. But Ibrahim Kendi says, well, we need to look, so he's a historian, he's an American historian, says we need to look at it in a different way, that we need to consider that it's possible, or, well, he argues quite strongly that what actually happens is that it's the economic imperatives. Because this is economically profitable, you then make the argument that these people are racially inferior, therefore it makes sense for us to economically exploit them. But if you had no economic imperatives, you wouldn't make the second argument. So we should think about it the other way around. And this is, you know, this system of colonization, the system of sort of presumptions of inferiority. It's often called a civilized mission. And you also have, till this day, the way in which we use language, which I think we should be quite careful with, considering the history that has gone before, the question of modernity, the idea that some countries are modern, and some countries are not. The late Professor Lanier argues that it is ridiculous to argue that Belgium is modern and the Congo is not, because they are coincidental, or they are sort of intertwined, they are coterminous, in the sense that Belgium's modernity is dependent on Congo's what you would call lack of modernity. So they're both modern. Their conditions, their situations are codependent. So we should be quite careful. And I also say, we should be careful in the way in which we think about development in that sense, where a country has been subject, or people have been subject to a long history of exploitation and appropriation. Saying that you're going to help them develop without acknowledging that history is, I would say, again, perverse. So this is my very brief overview of the mechanics and the logics of colonization. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have a good time with your unit this year. Thank you. Bye-bye.